Today's episode's all about helping our kids as they grow into their bodies. And it's interesting because you're right there in that with your kids as well. Before we get into more of it, can you help us understand what's happening in a kid's body during these key growth years, especially when they're active in sports? And then I think as you get at what age range are we talking about here when we have this conversation?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I've talked about it in the past, like what differentiates adult athletes from pediatric or adolescent athletes, and what you really think about is a couple key different areas. One of them is just musculoskeletal maturation. Another key area is hormonal maturation, and the final one is really their psychosocial development. And those are the three critical areas that separate young, growing athletes versus adult athletes. And so, and each period of time is different when you look at those. And so, your hormones are changing, and as you get older, obviously, your psychosocial development is changing, that whole time. And then again, your growth plates, your musculoskeletal development is changing across the way. And so I think, one key area I think about is around age 11 or 12. And this is where kids begin to develop this idea they're not so fixated on permanence. And they can start to see things being more fluid and dynamic. So in other words, you take a kid who is 5 or 6 and they find, they try something, and in their mind they're just not good at it. Or they're really good at it. But it's either black or white. Like there's no difference. So you're either good or not good at it. And they don't understand that you could practice at something, and if you're not good at it, become good at it. And that change starts around 12, where they can start to see that it's not as just ingrained one way or the other, that there is some opportunity to be different than where they are today. And so that's a big one for me is that age of 12. Every kid develops hormonally a little different. And so we think about what things are you trying to train in your kids in different sports, and really, a lot of strength training it's fine to do some of it. I think strength training in young kids is fine, but you got to be really careful because they're just not going to see the gains. So the focus on that at before puberty is just not really all that valuable. So and those younger kids under that period of age are really thinking about just skill acquisition, keeping it fun, working on, maintaining if they do have functional deficits in their strength or in their mobility or anything like that. That's where we kind of focus on that. And then as they progress through puberty, obviously you start adding on the things that are inherently benefited by those hormonal maturation periods. So that's kind of the difference between those two groups for me.
I am the epitome of what you're talking about, those things happening at different times, because so I have an October birthday, middle of October. I started school when I was 4 years old because I was already tall enough, and I had the I was more mature kind of. So my parents said, let's go ahead and start him. I was the tall kid all throughout elementary school and high school. I have pictures of me sitting in middle school next to somebody where I'm like full head and shoulders taller than them. But then I stopped growing at like 13 or 14. So like growing up, I was the kid that grew so fast that my muscles and tendons didn't really keep up well, and I sprained every lower ligament I could. And looking back as an adult, that psychosocial you're talking about, being a year younger than kids in my grade, there were some pieces that, oh, that's why that happened. They were a year more mature than I was, even though my body was there, even though my academics were there. That psychosocial piece was just a little behind that I didn't quite understand until I got older.
Yeah. That's absolutely true, and we see that. That's, it's been well reported that depending on where your birthday is and where you are in that sort of maturation, kids who have January birthdays, for instance, we know that they tend to be a little bit more advanced than the kids who have December birthdays of the same year, right? And so at younger ages, that year could be big. It'd be really, really massive. And then you take in that other part where, late bloomers and early bloomers and so forth, and you layer that in and so forth. And so there can be a huge impact of how quickly and where you are in the maturation phase on your athletic or physical development. And that's a tough one. I think, I think it takes a real skilled coach or parents or, teachers, what have you, to really be able to appreciate that and then modify where you are devoting that training or coaching or whatever to each of those kids, because they're all different, and you see it, you see that spectrum where, I think about a couple of the kids' teams now, and there's that kid that literally, they come up to their armpit, and the other kid's, a foot and a half taller than them, and, is already, looks like a teenager, and how different that is. And you can just imagine it's both physical and psychosocial, right? Psychosocially, this kid's like, well, I'm just not that good. It's like, no, you just haven't hit that growth phase or that maturation phase to really appreciate that. So big impact on that for sure.